The morning mist clung to Kuroda Island like a burial shroud, but nothing could mask the thunder rolling across the Pacific. Lieutenant Colonel Kenji Matsumoto pressed his field glasses against the concrete observation slit, watching the horizon birth a constellation of death. 47 heavy cruisers and battleships stretched across 20 miles of ocean, their massive guns already trained on his fortress. It was March 15, 1944, and what began as routine coastal defense duty was about to become the longest sustained naval bombardment in Pacific War history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Matsumoto commanded the 847th Coastal Defense Regiment, 3,200 men entrenched across Kuroda's volcanic ridges in fortifications that had taken 18 months to complete. Underground tunnels connected ammunition depots, command bunkers, and living quarters carved directly into the island's bedrock. Every defensive position had been engineered to withstand direct hits from battleship guns, with reinforced concrete walls 6 feet thick and steel blast doors protecting critical areas. The Japanese High Command had declared Kuroda Island impregnable, a fortress that could hold indefinitely against any assault. That confidence evaporated at precisely 0647 hours when USS Pennsylvania's 16-inch guns opened fire from 14 miles offshore. The first salvo sent tremors through solid rock, rattling equipment and men with equal violence. Matsumoto felt the mountain shake beneath his boots as shells weighing more than small automobiles crashed into his carefully prepared positions. Within minutes, the bombardment expanded into a symphony of destruction as cruiser 8-inch guns joined the battleship batteries, creating a wall of steel and explosives that transformed daylight into perpetual twilight. The initial bombardment plan, codenamed Operation Sledgehammer, called for 3 days of intensive naval gunfire to neutralize Kuroda Island's defenses before marine amphibious assault. Rear Admiral Thomas Mitchell, commanding Task Force 58, had assembled the most concentrated firepower ever directed against a single Pacific target. His flagship USS Iowa carried 9 16-inch guns capable of hurling 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells with devastating accuracy. Supporting battleships, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin added their own massive batteries, while heavy cruisers Baltimore, Boston, and Pittsburgh provided rapid-fire suppression against smaller defensive positions. The mathematical calculations seemed overwhelming in America's favor. Each battleship could deliver one 16-inch shell every 40 seconds, with individual rounds carrying enough explosive force to level city blocks. The cruisers maintained a firing rate of 4 8-inch shells per minute per gun, creating a continuous rain of steel across Kuroda surface installations. Admiral Mitchell's fire control officers had plotted every known Japanese position, establishing predetermined firing solutions that would systematically destroy each defensive complex through concentrated bombardment. But Lieutenant Colonel Matsumoto had spent 2 years studying American naval tactics, and his defensive preparations reflected hard-learned lessons from earlier Pacific campaigns. Instead of concentrating his forces in surface fortifications that invited destruction, he had dispersed the 847th Regiment throughout Kuroda's underground tunnel system. The main command bunker lay 40 feet beneath solid rock, connected by reinforced tunnels to subsidiary positions that could operate independently if communications failed. Artillery pieces were mounted on rail systems that allowed rapid repositioning between camouflaged firing positions, making counter-battery fire extremely difficult. The tunnel network represented Japanese engineering at its most sophisticated. Master Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, the regiment's chief engineer, had supervised construction teams working around the clock to create a subterranean fortress that could support extended siege operations. Air filtration systems provided breathable atmosphere even under chemical attack. Underground water sources and storage facilities contained supplies for 6 months of independent operations. Medical facilities, ammunition magazines, and repair shops were distributed throughout the complex, ensuring that isolated sections could continue fighting even if cut off from central command. When the first American shells began falling, the effectiveness of these preparations became immediately apparent. Surface installations absorbed tremendous punishment, with observation posts, barracks, and supply dumps disappearing under direct hits from battleship guns. But the heart of Japanese resistance remained untouched 40 feet below ground, where Matsumoto coordinated defensive operations from a command center that American intelligence had never detected. The psychological impact of sustained bombardment proved more challenging than physical destruction. Private Yoshio Nakamura, manning a forward observation post connected to the main complex by quarter-mile tunnel, described the experience in his diary. "The earth moves like ocean waves beneath our feet. Concrete dust fills every breath, while the endless thunder drives men to madness. Some soldiers cover their ears and rock back and forth, counting explosions that number in the thousands each day. Yet we endure, because Lieutenant Colonel Matsumoto moves among us, calm and determined, reminding us that our tunnels protect us from harm." American fire control evolved rapidly as the bombardment continued beyond its planned duration. When 3 days of intensive shelling failed to silence Japanese return fire, Admiral Mitchell recognized that conventional tactics would prove inadequate against Kuroda's unique defensive system. The Japanese continued launching sporadic artillery strikes from hidden positions that appeared and disappeared like ghosts, firing several rounds before relocating through underground passages that connected distant parts of the island. Captain Robert Harrison, commanding the heavy cruiser Salem, implemented innovative counter-battery techniques designed to track Japanese gun positions through flash detection and sound ranging. His fire control radar operators worked in coordination with spotter aircraft to triangulate enemy firing positions within seconds of muzzle flash detection. But even immediate response fire proved ineffective against artillery pieces that retreated into tunnel mouths before American shells could reach their targets. The Japanese defensive strategy centered on conservation and endurance rather than active resistance. Matsumoto ordered his artillery commanders to limit firing to brief harassment missions designed to demonstrate continued resistance while preserving ammunition for extended operations. Each gun position was allocated specific daily round counts with strict instructions to avoid sustained duels that would reveal locations to American counter-battery fire. The tunnel network represented Japanese engineering at its most sophisticated. Master Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, the regiment's chief engineer, had supervised construction teams working around the clock to create a subterranean fortress that could support extended siege operations. Air filtration systems provided breathable atmosphere even under chemical attack. Underground water sources and storage facilities contained supplies for 6 months of independent operations. Medical facilities, ammunition magazines, and repair shops were distributed throughout the complex, ensuring that isolated sections could continue fighting even if cut off from central command. When the first American shells began falling, the effectiveness of these preparations became immediately apparent. Surface installations absorbed tremendous punishment, with observation posts, barracks, and supply dumps disappearing under direct hits from battleship guns. But the heart of Japanese resistance remained untouched 40 feet below ground, where Matsumoto coordinated defensive operations from a command center that American intelligence had never detected. The psychological impact of sustained bombardment proved more challenging than physical destruction. Private Yoshio Nakamura, manning a forward observation post connected to the main complex by quarter-mile tunnel, described the experience in his diary. "The earth moves like ocean waves beneath our feet. Concrete dust fills every breath, while the endless thunder drives men to madness. Some soldiers cover their ears and rock back and forth, counting explosions that number in the thousands each day. Yet we endure, because Lieutenant Colonel Matsumoto moves among us, calm and determined, reminding us that our tunnels protect us from harm." American fire control evolved rapidly as the bombardment continued beyond its planned duration. When 3 days of intensive shelling failed to silence Japanese return fire, Admiral Mitchell recognized that conventional tactics would prove inadequate against Kuroda's unique defensive system. The Japanese continued launching sporadic artillery strikes from hidden positions that appeared and disappeared like ghosts, firing several rounds before relocating through underground passages that connected distant parts of the island. Captain Robert Harrison, commanding the heavy cruiser Salem, implemented innovative counter-battery techniques designed to track Japanese gun positions through flash detection and sound ranging. But even immediate response fire proved ineffective against artillery pieces that retreated into tunnel mouths before American shells could reach their targets. The Japanese defensive strategy centered on conservation and endurance rather than active resistance. Matsumoto ordered his artillery commanders to limit firing to brief harassment missions designed to demonstrate continued resistance while preserving ammunition for extended operations. Each gun position was allocated specific daily round counts with strict instructions to avoid sustained duels that would reveal locations to American counter-battery fire. The Japanese defensive strategy centered on conservation and endurance rather than preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. The psychological effect on American forces proved significant as sporadic Japanese fire continued despite overwhelming bombardment, suggesting defensive capabilities that exceeded intelligence estimates. Supply considerations dominated planning on both sides as the bombardment extended into its second week. American ammunition ships maintained continuous rotation, delivering replacement shells and powder charges to sustain the massive daily expenditure required for round-the-clock operations. USS Mount Hood, converted to ammunition transport duty, carried 3,000 16-inch shells alongside smaller caliber rounds for cruiser batteries. The logistical complexity required precise coordination as ships approached firing positions, transferred ammunition, and withdrew to safe distances, while maintaining operational security against possible Japanese submarine attacks. Japanese supply challenges proved more severe as surface communication with the mainland became impossible under constant bombardment. The tunnel system included pre-positioned ammunition magazines distributed throughout the complex, but Matsumoto recognized that extended siege operations would eventually exhaust even carefully hoarded supplies. Rationing systems implemented during the first week reduced individual food allocations to preserve stores for maximum operational duration, while medical supplies received priority distribution to forward positions where bombardment casualties mounted steadily. The physical transformation of Kuroda Island became apparent as the bombardment entered its third week. American shells had systematically destroyed every surface structure, creating a moonscape of overlapping craters and pulverized concrete. Trees that once covered the island's slopes had vanished, leaving bare rock scarred by shell fragments and scorched by explosions. The constant bombardment raised surface temperatures through friction and explosive heat, creating thermal conditions that made daytime observation difficult even from protected positions. Yet Japanese resistance continued from underground positions that American firepower could not reach. Lieutenant Akira Watanabe, commanding the Northern Sector Artillery, reported successful harassment missions against American shipping despite 3 weeks of continuous bombardment. His 105mm howitzer section had fired 247 rounds from 17 different positions, relocating through tunnel connections after each mission to avoid counter-battery response. The psychological effect on American naval personnel proved significant as unexpected Japanese fire demonstrated defensive capabilities that contradicted visual evidence of complete surface destruction. Weather factors complicated bombardment operations as Pacific storm systems brought heavy seas and reduced visibility during the fourth week of operations. Admiral Mitchell faced difficult decisions regarding operational continuation as ammunition expenditure exceeded pre-war planning estimates, while Japanese resistance showed no signs of diminishing. The task force had fired more than 50,000 heavy-caliber rounds without achieving the defensive neutralization required for amphibious assault, while Japanese return fire continued demonstrating active resistance. The strategic implications reverberated through Pacific Command as Operation Sledgehammer expanded far beyond original scope and duration. General Douglas MacArthur's overall Pacific strategy depended on rapid seizure of island strongpoints that could support further advance toward Japanese home islands. Extended siege operations tied down naval resources required for other campaigns, while demonstrating Japanese defensive capabilities that threatened similar delays at future objectives. Captain James Morrison, commanding the destroyer screen responsible for anti-submarine protection, reported increasing Japanese underwater activity as the bombardment continued. Enemy submarines approached firing positions under cover of bombardment noise, launching torpedo attacks against ammunition ships and withdrawing before effective counterattack could be organized. The USS Liberty Bell, heavily loaded with replacement shells, suffered torpedo damage that required emergency repairs and temporary withdrawal from operational area, reducing ammunition supply capacity during critical bombardment phases. Japanese morale remained surprisingly stable despite constant bombardment, as tunnel conditions provided physical protection and psychological security. Chaplain Lieutenant Masaru Fujita conducted daily services in the main command bunker, emphasizing spiritual preparation and collective endurance that sustained unit cohesion under extreme stress. His reports to Tokyo described soldiers who maintained discipline and determination despite conditions that would break conventional defensive formations. The tunnel ventilation system proved crucial to sustained operations as American forces began experimenting with chemical weapons designed to penetrate underground positions. Chlorine gas shells mixed with high explosive rounds created toxic atmospheres that would prove lethal in conventional bunkers. But Matsumoto's engineering preparations included air filtration and positive pressure systems that protected against chemical attack. Master Sergeant Tanaka's technical innovations allowed continued operations even when surface areas became contaminated with persistent chemical agents. By the end of March 1944, the bombardment of Kuroda Island had established patterns that would continue for months. American naval forces maintained systematic destruction of surface targets while Japanese defenders preserved strength through underground operations that could continue indefinitely. The siege had evolved into a test of industrial capacity against engineering preparation, with both sides committed to outcomes that would influence Pacific War strategy throughout remaining campaigns. The first month of bombardment concluded with Japanese positions damaged but operational. American ammunition expenditure exceeded all previous Pacific operations, and strategic timelines disrupted throughout MacArthur's advance toward Japan. What began as routine island neutralization had become the defining siege operation of the Pacific theater, demonstrating defensive capabilities that would reshape amphibious assault planning for the remainder of the war. Lieutenant Colonel Matsumoto's final report of March summarized conditions that would persist for 75 additional days of continuous bombardment. American firepower exceeds all previous estimates, but our preparations prove adequate to sustained operations. Underground positions remain secure, ammunition supplies continue adequate for limited operations, and soldier morale remains stable despite extreme conditions. We will continue resistance until relieved or destroyed, confident that our sacrifice serves the Emperor and demonstrates Japanese determination to defend every inch of sacred territory. The siege of Kuroda Island had only begun. April storms lashed the Pacific with unusual ferocity, but they could not silence the guns of Task Force 58. Admiral Mitchell watched mountainous swells crash over his destroyer's bows, while battleship batteries continued their methodical destruction of Kuroda Island. The bombardment had entered its 32nd day, consuming ammunition at rates that strained the entire Pacific supply chain. Yet Japanese resistance persisted with maddening consistency, sporadic artillery fire emerging from positions that should have been obliterated weeks earlier. The logistical challenges multiplied exponentially as Operation Sledgehammer stretched beyond all planning parameters. USS Pyro, the task force's primary ammunition ship, had completed 7 round trips to Pearl Harbor, each voyage carrying enough shells to level a major city. Her captain, Commander William Hayes, reported that his crew worked 18-hour shifts loading replacement ordnance, while stevedores at Hawaiian ports struggled to maintain the unprecedented supply flow. The entire Pacific ammunition production network had reorganized to support the Kuroda bombardment, with factories from California to Pennsylvania increasing shell production to meet Admiral Mitchell's insatiable requirements. Deep within Kuroda's tunnel system, Lieutenant Colonel Matsumoto faced equally complex supply calculations. His quartermaster, Major Saburo Ishida, maintained precise inventories that revealed the mathematical certainty of eventual defeat. Daily rice rations had decreased to 200 grams per man, barely sufficient to maintain combat effectiveness. Ammunition reserves stood at 40% of original levels, with strict firing restrictions preserving shells for critical defensive missions. Medical supplies presented the gravest concern as bombardment casualties mounted steadily, straining the underground hospital facilities beyond designed capacity. Yet morale remained remarkably stable through innovations that transformed survival into resistance. Corporal Keisuke Yamamoto, assigned to tunnel maintenance duty, had developed rapid repair techniques using salvaged materials and improvised tools. His crews worked continuously to maintain structural integrity as American shells penetrated deeper into the rock, creating new fissures that threatened ventilation and communication systems. The constant underground labor created a sense of purpose that sustained psychological resilience even when the surface world disappeared under endless explosions. American tactical evolution accelerated as conventional bombardment proved inadequate against Japanese defensive preparations. Captain Harrison aboard USS Salem pioneered delayed fuse techniques designed to penetrate underground positions through sequential explosions. His 8-inch guns fired specially modified shells that burrowed through surface rock before detonating, creating underground shockwaves intended to collapse tunnel systems. The innovation required precise timing and ballistic calculations, but initial results suggested potential effectiveness against subterranean targets. The Japanese responded with structural countermeasures that demonstrated remarkable engineering adaptability under extreme conditions. Master Sergeant Tanaka supervised construction of secondary tunnel networks that bypassed damaged sections while maintaining operational connectivity throughout the complex. His teams worked by lamplight, reinforcing weakened areas with salvaged steel and concrete debris from destroyed surface installations. The continuous construction activity created employment for soldiers who might otherwise succumb to psychological pressure from constant bombardment. Weather patterns during late April created temporary bombardment cessations that provided crucial respite for both sides. Typhoon Michiko generated sustained winds exceeding 60 knots, creating sea conditions that prevented accurate naval gunfire while limiting visibility to less than 100 meters. The storm lasted 4 days, allowing Japanese repair teams to address critical structural damage while American forces resupplied and redistributed ammunition loads across the task force. During the typhoon lull, Lieutenant Watanabe led reconnaissance missions to assess surface damage and locate new firing positions for his artillery section. The island's transformation shocked even veteran defenders who had witnessed daily destruction for more than a month. Familiar landmarks had vanished completely, replaced by overlapping craters that created an alien landscape of shattered rock and twisted metal. Yet the storm had also exposed new tactical opportunities as erosion revealed cave systems that could shelter additional gun positions. Intelligence gathering became increasingly sophisticated on both sides as the siege extended into May. American photo reconnaissance aircraft flew daily missions above bombardment areas using specialized cameras to detect signs of continued Japanese activity. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells, commanding the Photo Interpretation Unit aboard carrier USS Essex, developed innovative analysis techniques that identified underground positions through surface indicators invisible to conventional observation. Her team tracked patterns of debris movement, smoke emissions, and thermal signatures that revealed active tunnel systems despite comprehensive surface destruction. Japanese intelligence operations proved equally resourceful within severe limitations. Radio operator Sergeant Masaki Noda maintained contact with Tokyo through carefully scheduled transmissions that avoided American direction-finding equipment. His reports provided strategic intelligence about American capabilities and intentions while requesting specific supply items that could extend defensive operations. The communications required sophisticated encoding procedures and transmission timing that minimized detection while maintaining operational security. The psychological warfare dimension intensified as both sides recognized the propaganda value of extended siege operations. American radio broadcasts transmitted surrender ultimatums in Japanese, emphasizing the futility of continued resistance against overwhelming firepower. The messages included detailed casualty estimates and promises of honorable treatment for soldiers who abandoned defensive positions. Loudspeakers mounted on destroyers amplified the broadcasts across the island, creating psychological pressure that complemented physical bombardment. Lieutenant Colonel Matsumoto countered with inspirational addresses that emphasized spiritual duty and collective sacrifice for emperor and homeland. His speeches, transmitted through the tunnel communication system, reminded soldiers that their resistance delayed American advances elsewhere in the Pacific, potentially saving thousands of Japanese lives on other battlefields. The messages created shared purpose that transcended individual survival, transforming the siege into a spiritual test of national determination. Medical challenges grew critical as the bombardment entered its sixth week. Dr. Tomoyuki Sato, the regiment's chief medical officer, operated an underground hospital that treated injuries ranging from shell shock to traumatic amputations caused by near-miss explosions. His surgical facilities, carved from solid rock, provided sterile conditions despite primitive equipment and dwindling pharmaceutical supplies. The continuous medical operations required innovative techniques using improvised instruments and locally available materials for wound treatment and surgical procedures. American medical personnel faced different challenges as extended operations strained crew endurance across the task force. Ship's doctors reported increasing incidences of combat fatigue, hearing damage from continuous gun operations, and psychological stress among sailors who had maintained bombardment operations for longer than any Pacific engagement. The medical evacuations required rotation of personnel and equipment that complicated operational planning while reducing combat effectiveness. Supply chain innovations emerged as both sides adapted to requirements that exceeded pre-war planning assumptions. The American logistics network developed specialized ammunition handling procedures that reduced loading times while increasing safety margins for explosive materials. New ship designs incorporated lessons learned from extended bombardment operations with improved ammunition storage and transfer systems that could sustain high-intensity fire rates indefinitely. Japanese supply creativity focused on resource conservation and substitution techniques that extended operational duration beyond designed parameters. Mess Sergeant Ichiro Kawai developed nutritional programs using locally available materials supplemented with carefully rationed imported supplies. His innovations included seaweed cultivation in tunnel pools and protein extraction from marine life found in tidal caves, creating dietary variety that maintained morale despite severe restrictions. Artillery effectiveness declined gradually as ammunition shortages forced increasingly selective target engagement. Lieutenant Watanabe's battery had reduced firing to 3 rounds daily, carefully allocated to harassment missions that demonstrated continued resistance without wasteful expenditure. Each shot required precise planning and immediate repositioning to avoid counter-battery response that could eliminate irreplaceable equipment. The mathematical precision required for effective fire with minimal ammunition created professional challenges that maintained crew focus despite deteriorating conditions. Counter-battery technology advanced rapidly as American forces concentrated resources on elusive Japanese artillery positions. Radar-directed fire control systems provided near-instantaneous response to enemy muzzle flashes, while aerial observers coordinated with naval gunfire to bracket suspected positions within seconds of detection. The technological superiority created overwhelming advantages that gradually reduced Japanese firing opportunities to brief windows when weather or tactical conditions prevented immediate response. Structural degradation accelerated during the seventh week, as accumulated bombardment damage exceeded the tunnel system's designed resilience. Engineering surveys conducted by Master Sergeant Tanaka revealed critical weaknesses in primary support structures that threatened catastrophic collapse if bombardment continued at current intensity. His recommendations included abandoning several secondary positions while concentrating defensive efforts in the most structurally sound areas of the complex. The strategic implications reverberated throughout Pacific Command as Operation Sledgehammer consumed resources allocated for multiple concurrent operations. General MacArthur's staff recalculated invasion timelines while reassessing Japanese defensive capabilities that had proven far more resilient than intelligence estimates suggested. The prolonged siege demonstrated engineering and tactical innovations that might be replicated at other strategic objectives, potentially disrupting the entire Pacific advance schedule. Economic factors influenced decision-making as ammunition costs reached levels that concerned even wartime budgets accustomed to massive expenditures. Each 16-inch shell cost more than a new automobile, while daily ammunition consumption exceeded the gross domestic product of smaller nations. The financial calculations included production capacity, shipping requirements, and opportunity costs that affected resource allocation throughout the Pacific theater. Japanese defensive economics operated under different constraints, as limited resources required absolute efficiency to extend operational duration. Every material had multiple potential uses, with salvage and recycling operations that recovered usable components from destroyed equipment. The mathematical precision required for resource management under siege conditions created administrative challenges that tested organizational capabilities as severely as physical bombardment. Weather reconnaissance became increasingly sophisticated as both sides recognized meteorological factors that influenced bombardment effectiveness. Atmospheric conditions affected ballistic trajectories, while sea states determined firing accuracy from naval platforms. The scientific approach to weather prediction provided tactical advantages that could determine optimal timing for critical operations or defensive measures. By mid-May, the bombardment of Kuroda Island had established patterns that suggested indefinite continuation. American industrial capacity could sustain current expenditure levels, while Japanese defensive preparations proved adequate to prolonged operations. The siege had evolved into a contest of national will expressed through technological capability and individual endurance that would influence Pacific war strategy for months to come. Lieutenant Colonel Matsumoto's situation reports described conditions that tested human limits while maintaining operational effectiveness. His soldiers had adapted to subterranean existence that would have seemed impossible during peacetime training, developing survival techniques that preserved combat capability despite extreme deprivation. The transformation of civilian soldiers into siege specialists demonstrated Japanese adaptability that complemented engineering preparations in creating defensive capabilities that exceeded American expectations. The second phase of the siege concluded with positions largely unchanged, despite continuous bombardment that had consumed more ammunition than entire previous Pacific campaigns. Both sides prepared for continued operations that would test industrial capacity against human endurance in a contest where victory required either complete destruction or total collapse of enemy capability. June brought crystalline skies and mirror-calm seas that created perfect conditions for naval gunfire. Yet Admiral Mitchell found himself staring at ammunition records that defied comprehension. Task Force 58 had expended 127,000 shells of all calibers during 73 days of continuous bombardment. The USS Iowa alone had fired her 16-inch guns 2,847 times, wearing the rifling smooth and requiring barrel replacement that would sideline the battleship for weeks. Despite this unprecedented expenditure of firepower, Japanese artillery continued to emerge from Kuroda Island like vengeful spirits, firing single rounds before vanishing back into their underground maze. The breaking point arrived not through enemy action but through mechanical failure. Commander Hayes aboard USS Pyro reported that his ammunition hoists had suffered complete hydraulic breakdown after constant operation exceeding design specifications. Similar failures cascaded throughout the task force as equipment designed for occasional combat use succumbed to the grinding demands of perpetual siege warfare. Replacement parts became critically scarce as supply chains struggled to support operations that had exceeded every peacetime planning scenario. Within the tunnels of Kuroda Island, Lieutenant Colonel Matsumoto faced his own mechanical crisis. The main air filtration system had finally succumbed to vibration damage from weeks of bombardment, creating atmospheric conditions that threatened the survival of his remaining 800 men. Master Sergeant Tanaka's repair crews worked desperately with salvaged materials, but the complex machinery required precision components that no amount of battlefield ingenuity could replace. Carbon monoxide levels rose steadily in the deepest sections, forcing evacuation of critical command positions to areas closer to natural ventilation shafts. The final artillery duel began at dawn on June 2nd when Lieutenant Watanabe's battery emerged for what would prove to be their last coordinated fire mission. His 3 remaining 105mm howitzers had been carefully positioned in a natural cave system discovered during the April typhoon, their firing positions calculated to provide maximum psychological impact on American naval forces. The carefully hoarded ammunition represented weeks of conservation. 37 shells that would demonstrate Japanese resistance persisted despite overwhelming odds. The opening salvos achieved complete tactical surprise, with shells bracketing USS Missouri and forcing the battleship to emergency maneuvers that disrupted her firing solution. American counter-battery response arrived within 90 seconds, but Watanabe's crews had already withdrawn into tunnel connections that carried them safely beyond the blast radius. The brief engagement demonstrated tactical competence that contrasted sharply with the desperate nature of Japanese defensive operations. Admiral Mitchell's response reflected frustration accumulated over more than 2 months of siege warfare. He ordered simultaneous bombardment from all available batteries, creating a fire concentration that consumed 4,200 shells in 47 minutes. The sustained barrage generated seismic activity that registered on instruments aboard ships 14 miles offshore, while the island's surface temperature rose to levels that created visible heat distortion even from naval observation positions. Japanese casualties during this final bombardment exceeded all previous daily totals, as tunnel systems suffered catastrophic structural failure. Dr. Sato's underground hospital received 200 wounded soldiers within 3 hours, overwhelming medical facilities that had operated continuously for 11 weeks. The doctor worked without rest, performing emergency surgery by lamplight while debris from successive cave-ins threatened to bury his surgical teams alive. Many wounded soldiers died not from their injuries but from carbon monoxide poisoning as ventilation systems finally failed completely. The end came not through military defeat but through environmental collapse. On June 5th, the main tunnel complex lost atmospheric integrity when supporting pillars cracked under bombardment stress accumulated over 76 days. Lieutenant Colonel Matsumoto faced an impossible choice between surrendering his remaining soldiers or watching them suffocate in positions they could no longer defend. His final radio transmission to Tokyo reported that continued resistance would serve no military purpose, while guaranteeing the deaths of men who had already exceeded every expectation of duty and sacrifice. The surrender ceremony occurred at dawn on June 6, 76 days after the first American shells fell on Kuroda Island. Lieutenant Colonel Matsumoto emerged from a tunnel entrance accompanied by 347 survivors, many requiring immediate medical attention for malnutrition, respiratory ailments, and injuries sustained during the extended siege. Admiral Mitchell, observing the proceedings from USS Iowa's bridge, was struck by the disciplined formation maintained by soldiers who had endured conditions that would have broken conventional military units weeks earlier. The strategic implications of the Kuroda Island siege reverberated throughout Pacific command structures on both sides. American intelligence reassessed Japanese defensive capabilities, recognizing engineering and tactical innovations that could transform future amphibious operations into prolonged siege warfare requiring massive resource commitments. The ammunition expenditure at Kuroda exceeded the combined totals of all previous Pacific Island campaigns, demonstrating logistical requirements that strained even American industrial capacity. Japanese military leadership drew different lessons from the 76-day bombardment. General staff analyses emphasized the effectiveness of underground fortifications when properly constructed and adequately supplied, leading to accelerated tunnel construction programs throughout remaining Pacific strongholds. The psychological impact on American forces also received attention, with reports suggesting that prolonged siege operations created combat fatigue and equipment wear that could degrade offensive capabilities over extended periods. The human cost transcended simple casualty statistics. Of the 3,200 Japanese soldiers originally garrisoned in Kuroda Island, only 347 survived to surrender, while American medical personnel reported widespread psychological trauma among naval crews who had maintained bombardment operations beyond normal human endurance limits. The survivors on both sides carried memories of an engagement that pushed military technology and human resilience to absolute limits. Master Sergeant Tanaka's engineering reports provided technical analysis that influenced fortification design throughout the remaining war. His documentation of tunnel construction techniques, ventilation requirements, and structural reinforcement methods became standard references for defensive engineering projects. The innovations developed under siege conditions proved applicable to civilian construction, contributing to post-war building techniques in earthquake-prone regions. Lieutenant Colonel Matsumoto's final interview with American intelligence officers revealed strategic thinking that had sustained Japanese resistance for more than 2 months. His emphasis on psychological warfare, resource conservation, and morale maintenance provided insights into Japanese military culture that influenced occupation policies during the post-war period. The respect demonstrated by American officers reflected professional recognition of competence displayed under impossible conditions. The Kuroda Island bombardment concluded with lessons that shaped Pacific War strategy through its final phases. American forces developed specialized siege equipment and tactics, while Japanese defenders refined underground construction techniques that would appear at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and throughout the homeland defense preparations. The 76-day siege demonstrated that modern warfare could devolve into prolonged attritional contests, where victory depended as much on industrial capacity and human endurance as on tactical brilliance or technological superiority. Years later, survivors from both sides would remember Kuroda Island not for its strategic significance, but for its demonstration of human resilience under conditions that exceeded every previous test of military endurance. The thunder that had echoed across the Pacific for 76 consecutive days finally fell silent, leaving only the memory of what soldiers could accomplish when duty demanded the impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.